God is not a concept or a term. He's far beyond that. Right. It doesn't mean that we can't say true things that apply, but it's like they're true and they apply in a very, like, it's like one divine ray, right? One of the divine rays, but God transcends that limited divine ray that comes down to us, as St. Basil says. And a lot of people don't understand that apophatic theology itself, which you point out in your essay, necessitates the essence energy distinction, because what it's necessitating is that God cannot be said to be God is whatever with definitional simplicity or with definitional is of identity, right? Anytime we attach an is of identity to what God is, we are trapping ourselves in the absolute divine simplicity box. If God is one, then we're led to the conclusion, if we want to be logically consistent, that he can't be many, because if he's many, then the many is somehow maybe subordinate, or they're just virtual terms or nominal terms that try to describe.
Yeah, Aquinas calls them virtual distinctions.
Exactly. So the terminology apophatic is part and parcel with what we'll see later, the energies, but it necessitates the essence energy distinction. So it fits with what we're saying about concepts and word definitions, to show from the Orthodox perspective, there's not a definition like, oh, I go to Webster's and then I say, what is God? God is a perfectly spiritual, rational substance, right? This is like a classical Latin, Protestant scholastic definition, who is ultimately one and invisible. Is that what God is? Like a thought form, like the number 7, like a geometric form, or a ghost? Or no, that's not what God is. God is more than that. It doesn't mean that some of those terms aren't at times applied. God is spirit, God is invisible, yes, but they're not definitional.
That's right. Because, it's interesting. We should actually talk about what the word definition actually means. To define, the etymology of that is to make borders around. So if you define a property, you're putting fences and borders. And so when you come up with a good definition, what you want to do is define. And everything that you want in the box, the borders, is included and everything excluded. So obviously with a triangle, you don't want to have circles and trees and cars and houses. And then you want to have everything outside not to be triangle. But obviously, if God is beyond being, you can't even define being, because that would mean that, as Parmenides says, everything outside of defining being would be non-being, which is impossible. Non-being cannot be. And a fortiori, even more so, God, who is beyond being, who creates being, can't be defined. So just going to the etymology makes a lot of sense. You cannot put borders and fences around in concept and bring God down into concept in your mind. So
let's expand that, because the immediate objection is going to be, but now wait a minute. So many church fathers, they say, they'll use terms and phrases. God says I am. God says he's perfect being. God says he's perfect pure existence. But what you're saying is that God isn't those things. So you're contradicting yourself, and you don't follow the church fathers. I've had this argument so many times. My response would be, obviously, yes, God exists and he has being and so forth, but those are energetic revelations about him. And that's because no term, no concept, no singular human finite concept defines what God is. God is revealed to us not as essence, first and foremost, not as a pure unity, a spiritual substance. God comes to us in the person of the Father, and in the person of the Son, and in the person of the Spirit.
Right.
So we have a personal experience and confrontation with a God that we are accountable to, as opposed to rationalizing about impersonal essences and forces and this. It's two different approaches, and that's what's so key to see, that this apophatic approach is perfectly in line with the personal approach of orthodoxy, the existential approach of orthodoxy, as opposed to a an approach that first and foremost goes for the intellect.
Right, and I think that if the great I am were to be identified with God's essentia is his essay, being and essence are one and the same in God, and that's what is said on Mount Sinai. That, I mean, how do we make sense then that Christ is a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks?
Well, to say that I am equals ousia or essence would also be to confuse nature and person. It would be to confuse the personhoods, because I would be he. Either you could say it's the Father speaking in the Son. You could say it's the Logos. Jesus says I am, right? He's identifying himself as the angel of the Lord in Exodus 3:14. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the triadic revelation of from the Father through the Son and the Spirit in the theophany. It's still personal. And to say, as many Roman Catholics do, which is the meaning of Actus Purus, that to be is identical with God saying he is his essence, that is modalism confusing nature and person.
Absolutely, that's a great point. All heresies begin with confusion of person and nature. And again, so why is it foolishness to the Greeks? Because the Greeks always had a primacy of ousia, essence,
right,
and had really no concept of personhood. And so to now speak of God in a personal way and the personhood being primary, that it's the personhood that, as we've spoken before, that ousia, as St. Basil says, cannot exist in a naked state, but is always in hypothesized within personhood. That's what's foolish to the Greek. They've never heard that before.
Yeah.
So if it was the Thomistic scholastic understanding, I'd expect the Greeks would not think it's foolish.
Correct. I mean, and that's the Hellenic synthesis.
Yeah.
Its whole project is to make this system not seem foolish to the Greeks. But that's precisely why it seems foolish to the Greeks, is because they're like, no. You know, what's primary is the mind attaining to gnosis of ideas, of reason. That's what's primary to the Greeks. So yeah, they would find much more solace in the generic ideas of scholasticism, which is ultimately a kind of rationalism. So that was our next question is, okay, so now that we've gotten the ideas of ousia, maybe let's hop to the controversial one, hypostasis. Now, I would say to people who want to get into the patristics of this, and they say, well, I'm not ready to jump into John Damascus. Is there an earlier place I would start? I would say, yes, you can read Basil's letter, Epistle 32 and Epistle 38, especially Epistle 38, which is pretty long. And then if you get those done, go to On the Holy Spirit, because those letters explain from Basil's mindset, ousia, physis, nature, and hypostasis, person. And so he goes into great depth to make it very clear that in God, there's a common essence and nature that we don't know. We can't define it. We're told that it's there. It's revealed. God has revealed us that there's one common essence that the Father transmits from the Son from the Father through the Son and the Spirit. Thus, there's one nature, one Godhead, but it comes not in some emanation, but from the person of the Father. The Father begets the Son, and that's how the Son is a direct offspring of the Father's nature, right? It's not to say that there's no relationship between the essence of the Father and the Son, but if we make essence primary, what happens is that the individual persons lose their particularity and their significance. That's why we can't start with that. We also,
you wouldn't be able to tell the difference in the persons of the Trinity too.
Correct.
You will lose the Father as the Logos Physios, who is the principle of the nature that's eternally begotten to the Son.
To the Son, exactly. Right. So it is the reason that the Son has the same essence is because he's begotten of the Father. Right. That's why he possesses the same essence. It's not because if you started with the essence of God and you said that, well, we know that Jesus is fully divine because the divine essence is because Jesus is like he comes from essence, but Jesus doesn't beget himself. The Father begets Jesus, right? So even the very existence of the Son, this is what's unique to the idea of orthodoxy with hypostatic properties as opposed to speculations about the essence of God or the unity of God. Hypostatic properties is what individuates and distinguishes the three hypostases, the three persons, not relations of opposition, not speculations about, trinities in nature, not this kind of stuff. We start there, and that way we don't get into confusion. So hypostasis is, simply put, and I know you can comment on this as well, it answers the question of who, right? We've talked about what, nature corresponding to the question of, well, what is that thing? What is a human, right? Well, it's all the individuals that possess human nature, okay? But humans aren't just a bunch of, natures. They're also individuals who possess something beyond just a common universal nature, right? They also possess this particular quality that we call personhood or hypostasis, right? So I'm the particular person, Jay. You're the particular person, Father Deacon Ananias, so on and so forth. And even the Eastern Fathers are very clear many times over. It's not the same with God, but it's similar, right? The way that God exists obviously is more infinitely greater and different from the mode of being that humans possess, but there's still a similarity between the fact that there's a unity of natures that humans share, but there's also a particularity of humans in terms of, I'm the person me, you're the person that you are. And so in God, it's similar, but also radically different because God is not three separate persons. I'm a separate person from you. You're a separate person. In God, it's different. There's a singular ousia essence, right?
That's right.
But there's three hypostases. And at this point, a lot of people say, well, but that sounds like, how could you avoid, wouldn't you be saying if there's real distinctions in God, doesn't that necessitate some kind of like tritheism? And we would say no, because God, as St. Dionysius says and St. Gregory Palamas says, God transcends the logical categories of human thought and reason and philosophy, not because it's irrational per se, but that it's supra-rational. The unity that God possesses is a unity beyond our conception of the number one. So the unity that God has is not like equal to one. We can say there is one God, and God is in one sense one, but there's also a particularity in God, a multiplicity in God that transcends number. The fathers even say this, right? The Trinity does not equal 1 and 3, or the numerals 1 and 3. Those are symbols, those are concepts, those are created. We can say God is 1 and 3, but he's also far beyond those very limiting things. So this is why apophatic theology, this is why the distinction between nature and person is so key in the Trinity. It's also going to come to bear in Christology. So I've talked for a long time, but I think you would agree with that.
Yeah, and these kinds of objections are kind of fallacies from ignorance, from kind of a sort of empiricism that, well, if I've never experienced, for example, somebody was asking me, how could the Son be begotten and not made? Well, you only seem to have a problem with that because everything that you've seen begotten is made, but there's no logical contradiction in that. That's a
great point.
That coming forth eternally does not within its concept necessitate a making or coming from non-existence into existence. And so it's just kind of a silly argument that because I've never experienced it doesn't exist. And so the same way with
they're relying on a creaturely definition and saying that in the analogous in the analogia here that we're using, it must always be the exact same way, even in God from all eternity, because in creaturely relations, begetting has beginning, a middle, and an end, and there's a lesser son. The son is some other offspring or something. So in God, there can't be a full unity because of the creaturely definitions of those things.
Right. And, relating to that, I found a really good Meyendorff quote it's talking about all of this and in hypostatization. And he states that, quote, the human nature of Christ is not personalized into a separate human hypostasis,
right.
Which means that the concept of hypostasis is not an expression of natural existence, either in God or in man, but it designates a personal existence. So here you see that he's making a distinction between nature and persons, hypostasis. What's really important is the post-Chalcedonian definitions, and the post-Chalcedonian Christ understanding of Christ postulates that Christ was fully man, and also that he was a human individual. But you have to remember, it rejects the Nestorian view that he was a human hypostasis. This is straight from Meyendorff.
Right.
Or a human person.
Right.
A fully human individual, life and hypostasized in the hypostasis of the Logos without losing any of its human characteristics. That's straight from Chalcedon. Divine nature and human nature could never merge or be confused or become complementary to each other, but in Christ they were united in the single divine hypostasis of the Logos. Mm-hmm. As you always say, as the proper subject.
The soul
divine
subject,
model matched the human image, and the fact that the notion of hypostasis is irreducible, don't we always say this, to the concepts of particular nature. Exactly. Or to the notion of individuality.
Correct.
Is crucially important not only in Christology, but also in Trinitarian theology.
Yes, so, it's the same, exactly, because, and we said this in the past, because if hypostasis only meant the concretization, individualization, or particularization of nature, then there would not really be a distinction in the hypostasis, and the Father begetting the Son would just be some kind of Thomistic, virtual, nominal classification. It wouldn't be a real begetting of the Father to the Son. But that's a real eternal begetting, and they're really distinct. And once we recognize that, we can't fall into saying that it's modalism. We can't fall into Christ being a half human, half divine, equal problem, like plus this equals the God-man. That's not what the God-man means. The God-man means he possesses a fully human nature, fully divine nature, but this is where in hypostatize comes into play. This is the next step we want to take, because a lot of people you've been here to say, oh, nature and person. Okay, maybe I get that with Trinity and humans, that makes sense, but it still seems too abstract. Well, St. Cyril has you the solution. St. Cyril says that there's a mode in which nature always is.
Yes.
Okay, you're correct, Cyril would say. He would say, there's no abstract human nature floating out there in Plato's ether. You're right. He says every time that there is an instance of human nature, which is common, which is universal, he's so emphatic about this. He says it always exists in the mode, or tropos, T-R-O-P-O-S, of hypostasis, of persons. And so he says that when you combine this concept, when you say nature always existing in the mode of person, he calls this inhypostatized. And so humans, I, as the hypostasis J, I inhypostatize human nature. The actions that I do, they are also inhypostatized. They are human actions proper to human nature, but they are enacted into time and space by a person, hypostasis, using that nature, putting that mode of nature into being, into existence.
Yeah, that's exactly what he says. Hypostasis is the personal acting source of your natural life.
Exactly. Bingo.
It's not the nature or life itself. It's not just a concretization of nature. It's the acting source of the natural life.
Yeah.
So in that sense, hypostatic personhood is primary.
This is why Cyril was so adamant to that idea of Christ being of the divine hypostasis being the sole subject in Christ, because he wanted to undercut any possibility of Nestorius allowing a created hypostasis. So the human nature, ultimately, as it comes to be defined by in the time of the post-Chalcedonians, you eventually have a victory of the Kyrillic view. It's called the Neo-Kyrillic view. It wins out by 553, and then Maximus expands on that as well. But they stress this idea because even the humanity has for its personal subject the divine hypostasis from all eternity, who is the Logos. So the only subject, St. Cyril says very, very emphatically against Nestorius, over and over and over, in all of these events in Christ's life, whether it's the wedding at Cana, whether it's the thirsting, the crying, the hunger, the walking on water, the experiencing of death in his human nature, the only subject who's experiencing all of those is one singular divine hypostasis, the Logos. Now, to human modern Western ears, that sounds like, that doesn't make any sense, because a person is like that dude over there. Right. And if you don't say that Jesus is, like that dude over there, then he wasn't really human. You're denying the full humanity of Christ.
I think it's a concretization, and
exactly
only concretization, and that's incorrect.
Right. Exactly. So that's why it's so key to understand in hypostatize. It's the mode. Nature's always existing in the mode of hypostasis. In the mode of persons, right? And sometimes the term tropos is used, which is brought in. And in this context, it's referring to the mode at which something exists. And this is actually also going to be very important for triadic theology when we get to really hairy, dicey questions about, now, wait a minute, who became incarnate?
Yes.
We're going to see why this is so necessary for triadic theology as well, because the Father didn't die. The Father didn't become incarnate. Spirit didn't become incarnate. Spirit didn't die. So we have to have a Trinitarian theology that makes it possible for there to be distinctions that are real enough in the Trinity, and not Thomistic virtual ones, but real distinctions, such that one of the hypostases can enter into a mode of being that the other two do not. And if absolute divine simplicity is true in the Thomistic sense, that's really not possible. Because if you look at the kind of argumentation they use about like why absolute divine simplicity means X, Y, Z, you follow it through. Well, if Jesus can't be a pre-incarnate theophany, if the arguments against that from the Thomistic Roman Catholic view are true, then he can't become incarnate, right? If you're going to argue that, well, those Old Testament theophanies can't be the Logos, because you can't have one hypostasis entering into time and space in a specific mode that the other two do not, because that would compromise the simplicity of the Trinity. They argue this.
Now they'll go around and pull out quotes that what God does, but what we're trying to point out is that's obviously inconsistent. So just because you can find quotes that agree with the Orthodox position, it doesn't matter, because certainly Aquinas thought that the second person, the Logos, is who became incarnate. Sure, no doubt. Absolutely, he thought that. Nobody's honestly questioning that he thought that. But what we're saying is that these two elements in the theological system don't match up. So we need these ideas that Orthodox theology transformed, that are nuanced enough to allow for the flexibility to have things like one hypostasis entering into a mode of being that the other two do not. That's why tropoi, they become very important in triadic theology, right? And it's not just because of the incarnation, it's also the roles that the persons play. Because I'm sorry for rambling so long. No, this is great.
This comes up, for example, in debates with Muslims. Muslims will corner a lot of Western Christians on texts where Jesus says, I honor my Father. I come to do the will of the Father. And they'll say, hey, you Christians, you claim Jesus is a divine person, but you're saying that he's coming to do the will of the Father. How does that match up with Trinitarian theology? If you don't have this concept of roles in eternity, roles in creation, roles in redemption, you'll never get this. You'll never be able to explain it. But only Orthodox theology possesses this nuance, this dogma, it actually is dogmatic, because it shows how we always believe from the Father through the Son in the Spirit. That applies to how the persons come to be in all eternity, from the Father through the Son and the Spirit. That's the way that the Trinity manifests from all eternity.
And they can't get this because they have the same paradigm that the scholastics do.
Exactly. It's also
of this dialectics of opposition of one and many.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's so important, especially in Chalcedon too, that why are we saying that Christ's two natures can accomplish union without confusion?
Yeah, there's no dialectical tensions. Yeah.
The entire Trinity is displayed through Christ.
Yes.
And that you don't have this dialectical opposition. They retain, all the persons of the Trinity retain their natural characteristics, but they share in a hypostatic life. Now, if you have a paradigm in which you can't reconcile one in the many, then this isn't going to mix, and you're going to think that we're saying something else. But this and this gets to the word of perichoresis, that they're all sharing within one another common hypostatic life, which enables Christ's human actions, his words and gestures, to display not only the divine nature, but the entire Trinity.
Correct. And so even though each person, whether it's in creation or whether it's in redemption or whatever, and it's always in the triadic mode of from the Father through the Son and the Spirit, they still have specific roles. Now, this is not modalism. We're not saying masks. We're using role in the way that the Eastern Fathers specify this, right? So the Father is the source, beginning, font, cause, arche, monarchia, beginning principle. It all comes from the Father, and it extends through. They'll say, sometimes the Father will say, well, creation, for example, the Word is the creative power. The Father, the source, the Word, the creative power, the Spirit, the perfecting telos, you could say, the what perfects what comes to be. So that's in relation to creation. Not saying from God in himself, but when God creates, that's the triadic roles that each person has. Each one of those persons' actions are still triadic. You're correct. Just like the theophanies are still triadic, but there's specific roles that each one of them takes consistently. That doesn't mean that when the Son does an action, it's apart from the Father, right? This is why we're so against these either ors, like you said, right? So somebody would say, oh, well, you're saying that if Jesus becomes incarnate, then he's doing something that the Father didn't do, so they don't have the same will. No, the will is singular, but it's being manifested or put into the mode of being which it's enacted hypostatically is unique to each person. So there's a singular event or action, you could say, but it's manifested or put into effect in a unique way by the Father and the Son and the Spirit.
Yeah,
so
Maximus puts it in a really great way that, God is monad, he's one, according to the principle, the arche of his essence. So that's the idea that his ontological unity is not compromised or affected by the fact that he's hypostatically 3 in 1. So if you have a false paradigm, you're not going to be able to get that. But it's that he is triad, as Maximus says, according to his mode of existence, and Maximus goes on to qualify, that means much more than 3 hypostases are merely 3 modalities.
Correct. Because
they constitute the life of God, according to Maximus.
Right.
As we said.
So, like, it's not the Father walking on water. It's the Son within time and space doing that. But that action is still triadic, because everything that Jesus is doing, he says, I do by the will of what the Father wants. He is from the Father. And he can even say that, although I have come here, John says he was always in the bosom of the Father, because he's eternally begotten, right? So it transcends the limitations of the either ors. And this is what's so key, because all heresies will fall into these either ors. So one last, I would say, add on to your point about perichoresis, the indwelling
Yes.
is that from what I recall, this begins in the Eastern Fathers, particularly St. Maximus applies it to Christology. And he wants to utilize this as a way to explain how the two natures in Christ interpenetrate one another without either of them losing their constituent properties.
Absolutely. Yep.
Then it takes on a little bit of a turn, and there could be Eastern Fathers who do use it for the Trinity that I don't recall, but I know that for a fact St. John Damascus does pretty heavily. He'll say, no, actually another way that we know the unity of God, aside from just the Father communicating in that singular essence to the Son and the Spirit, is that they all three indwell one another. And even if there's an indwelling, one hypostasis can still enter into a mode of being that the other two do not. Right. So the Son can become incarnate, even though the Spirit and the Father indwell him, but it's still possible for the Son to enter into a specific mode of being. And it's another argument for the deity of Christ, or that the persons share equal divinity, essentially, in the argument that John Damascus makes.
Yeah, great points, Jay.
Okay, so we've got in hypostatize, we've got ousia, nature, we've got actual
cause.
Say what? Oh, cause, yeah. So would you add any? I mentioned there when I was talking about the Father. One thing I would say is, so we have these terms that the Eastern Fathers will commonly kind of throw out: ungenerate, unbegotten, arche, monarchia, the principle, the cause. These are the terms that are typically used to describe the hypostasis of the Father. They all kind of encapsulate the same idea, and they're encapsulating his unique hypostatic property. So we're not going to start by categorizing God according to what's common in terms of the essence, because we want to know first and foremost how God reveals himself to us. And if he reveals himself to us in terms of persons, then we should begin, as the Son did, as Jesus did, with saying the Father. Why do you call me good? There's one good, the Father. Jesus isn't denying that he's also fully good as the Father is good, but he's saying, again, always honoring the Father, because the Father is the source, the fount, the principal, arche. My only last point there would be that when we speak of him as cause, Athanasius was very adamant, St. Athanasius, against the Arians, to stress that this is a term that's helpful. It's not a one-to-one equivalence between temporal human causation, Aristotelian causation, and then reading that back into God. No. When we say the Father is the cause, he's the eternal cause of the Son and the Spirit.
Well, that's why the Cappadocian Fathers stress so much the word monarchia.
Right.
That the Father is basically the glue, the very glue of the Trinity, the core of the Trinity, that he's the single source. And the Greek word arche is rule or principle or first principle. And so the one mono, archeia, is the one unique source or principle of the Son and the Holy Spirit. So you get both the Son, that is the eternal Logos, and the Holy Spirit, and their being and hypostatic, their personal existence is from the Father's person,
right,
and being ousia. And so that kind of fleshes out the monarchia and why we Orthodox use that. And this becomes important too, because it's in direct opposition of the West and their addition to the filioque clause in the double procession doctrine.
Yeah, exactly.
Why all these? Right. Why are these? So why are you and IJ stressing these terms? Why do we need to clarify this? Why do we use philosophy to clarify? It's because if you confuse these things, if you confuse nature and person in these various ways, then you end up in heresy and you start having double processions or modalism. And so it's very important.
Right. So the Son, I remember the first time I read the Mystagogy, I was kind of struck by that fact. Like, it really hit me that, so what St. Photius is saying is the source of unity is not generic essence, not generic oneness, because I had Latin mindset thinking from Aquinas and so forth. No, the source of unity is hypostatic. And if we remember, as we said about in hypostatized, the divine nature is in hypostatized in each of the persons. But because we're starting with the Father, if the Son is going to be begotten, if he's going to possess that eternal, or excuse me, that the full divine nature that the Father possesses, if we remember that the divine essence is in hypostatized, it's in hypostatized in the person of the Father. So when the Father communicates the divine nature to the Son, and this is why St. Athanasius is fine to say, we would absolutely agree. So Roman Catholics will misuse this quote and they'll say, no, wait a minute. Athanasius says that Jesus is the direct image of the Father's nature. He's the direct offspring of the Father's nature. Aha, we got you, divine simplicity, ADS. They'll say this. And we say, no. It's in hypostatized. The divine nature is it exists in the mode of the Father. And that's why, yes, it's the Father's nature that Jesus is the direct offspring of. He's not the direct offspring of some impersonal essence. Then he would be, if that was so, he would beget himself. That's crazy. Nobody says that.
I mean, even think when we hear the Lord is God and has revealed himself to us. Is Lord in a generic ousia? And
oh, good point. No.
Lord is personal.
Absolutely.
And this is what he's revealed to us. It's the first and foremost starting.
The Lord is he, right? I mean, it's pretty consistently defined. Yeah.
That's right. The Lord is he. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Personal pronoun.
Exactly. So
let's talk a little bit about cause, because that relates to cause. I'll just say a little bit.
Right. So single source, we don't locate this single source in what's common to the persons. The single source is located in the person, hypostasis of the Father. This is what makes Orthodox triadology unique. And I know that there's going to be a couple uniates and Roman Catholics because, but wait a minute, in the Vatican clarification of the Filioque, we admit the principal source of the Father. Yes, but even the Vatican clarification of the Filioque says there's still tension between this issue of Florence, because of the wording of Florence is very clear that the Son is, you can twist it into these different things. Well, he's a co-cause with the Father. Oh, he's one single principle with the Father. That is the origin of the person of the Spirit, you see, from all eternity. That's where it gets problematic, is because however they want to twist it into a co-cause, a single cause, a secondary cause, you can't introduce these levels and layers of new, there's like a co-cause now, secondary cause, where the Father is the source of the hypostasis, but the Son gives his being to the Spirit. So he gives the Spirit another quality. That's it. They'll actually try to come up with these scholastic additions of okay, the Father mainly is the cause, but the Son's kind of like the secondary. He adds some stuff to the equation. No. That's why the Son possesses nothing to do. He possesses nothing of the Father's unique
principle
quality as cause. Correct. He alone. This is why there's a great quote from St. Gregory Nazianzus. He says, the Son possesses all that the Father has except for being sole cause. It's a great quote, which undercuts the Filioque totally.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's important to talk about cause too, because moderns have a really difficult time with this notion of causality, because from the Enlightenment, it rejected the ancient kind of notion of a nuanced and robust notion of causality. And so we typically, according to modern science, post-Enlightenment, think of cause is always restricted to temporality.
Right.
Cause
the Arians did this too.
Yes, they did it too. Cause always precedes its effect in time. But when you go back, this is why it's important to go back to etymologies. And for example, even just going back to Plato, and I have people that have a hard time understanding this. How could the form of the good, which is Plato's kind of understanding of God, be the cause of eternal non-created forms? And it's because they're bringing a modern interpretation of causality to bear on that text, and they can't solve it. And so it's important that we flesh out what cause actually means. It's much more robust and nuanced than a modern mechanistic efficient causality.
Mm-hmm.
And cause actually, it's a Latin word. It derives from the Latin word causa, causus, which really goes back to the word in Latin caudere, which means to fall. It means something brings it about, that something turns out to be such and such a way. But I think the Greek word aetion, which means that which something's indebted to, or the being responsible for bringing into appearance or occasion. Now, notice none of those words necessitate temporal succession or temporality, but an indebtedness. And so you can have, for example, and it's a notion of an explanation. What is indebted? The Son is indebted to the Father for his eternal bringing forthness, his appearance to. And you don't have to restrict it to this notion of temporal causality, that the cause must proceed. No, they're co-eternal. There's nothing within it. So this is why it's important also to go back to the etymology, to study the historical occurrences of the notion of cause, so that you really understand that the fathers are using a much more nuanced, more robust idea of causality that doesn't get us into these problems of Arianism and other issues, heretical issues too.
Yeah. So another great example of this is in the 100 the chapters on theology, St. Maximus. I've mentioned it many times, but he says we can speak of God as arche, sustainer, and telos, the beginning, middle, and end of creation. He's like, but we also can't speak of God as beginning, middle, and end, because God himself has no beginning, and middle, and end. So Maximus makes this great point, which we would stress to the Thomists, that it's not any of these words or any of these systems or these ideas from Aristotle. Is God the cause? He is the cause when we speak of the Father and that eternal relationship, but that relationship of God the Father as cause is not equivalent to God as cause of the created world. Right? He is the cause of the Son, and he's the cause of the created world, but they're not equivalent words. And so Maximus can say, is God the beginning, middle, and end of history? Yes, because he kicks it off, he sustains it in existence, and then he's also the telos, the meaning of all history. But he's also not beginning, middle, and end, because so it depends on how you are using this. Is it theology proper? Is it economia? God in relationship to the world, right?
Well, the problem of thinking that words are always univocal.
Right. Which is ironic, because you would think the Thomists would agree with Aquinas that it's not univocal predication, but when it comes to philosophic systems, they seem to think that it is univocal predication. But that, and I bring that up because there was actually some Thomists 2 weeks ago who were making a big deal about this, because they said, look, I found in St. Maximus, he says God is the first cause. He says God is the sustainer. He's also the telos. Boom, we proved that Maximus is essentially 100% in line with Thomas Aquinas. Oh, but wait a minute. No, he's not, because he's using terms. St. John of Damascus is using terms. They're not the equivalent of the way that Aquinas understands them. So one reason, Father Deacon and I, Dr. Ananias and I, the reason we're doing this is because of the word concept fallacy. And I forgot to mention this from the kickoff. We should have said, why is this a debate? Well, word concept fallacy is just assuming that there's a singular meaning, and that when a word pops up, well, it always means the same thing, right? So what we're showing is that in a lot of ancients use these terms in different ways, and they're transformed. This was so key. From when I was mired in Thomism, I didn't really consider orthodoxy until I realized, and it was a long, hard road because I'm hard-headed, that the words don't have synonymous meanings. They take on a more nuanced sense in the Eastern Fathers. And I had to read the Eastern Fathers before I saw that. before I did, I just assumed, oh, well, they mean the same thing that Aquinas means. Of course they mean the same thing. Yeah, that's always a logos just means logos. No, it doesn't. It depends. And
You know,
that's what,
that's a great point too. That, and I know this must be frustrating with those who are intellectually minded. That when it comes to Orthodox theology, it's like Evagrius Pontus says, the true theologian is the one who prays, and the one who prays is the true theologian. That to really grasp the life and how these words are used, you must incarnate yourself in the life of the church, the fathers. Yes. So
this is the next word.
Switching a paradigm and saying, I've converted, now I believe this. We're always incarnational and we're always relational. Mm-hmm. And therefore we have to enter into a relationship with Christ and the saints and the Mother of God in the liturgy, with your fellow parishioners, with the fathers. And then your nous begins to open and illuminate and correct the mind that's diseased and stained with all the false paradigms and heresies. And I mean, it's what we do when we're baptized, right? Do you renounce you're now becoming illumined, and you're going to start to what these terms actually mean?
Yeah, this was something Father Moody said to me, and he actually just said it in a comment one day, and he probably said it in passing, but it struck me because it was exactly what I needed to hear at the time. Because he said, when you look at all of these terms and the way they're using the fathers, and I think there was a Thomist or somebody was saying, who cares if we use these Greek terms? Yes, it's not ultimately about superstition about the Greek symbols of the letters and the using the phrase, the vocal cords of enunciating Greek terms. It's what the terms mean. That's the whole point, because symbols and terms are polyvalent. They can mean different things. They can turn and move and evolve, but what they mean is very key. And so Father Moody said something that was very new to me. He said, you are not going to understand Orthodoxy until you attain the Orthodox phronema. And he said, and in order to obtain the Orthodox phronema, it's important to understand these terms in the way that the fathers meant it. And they meant it in a specific, precise way. And then I realized, that's why you have to unlearn the scholastic stuff, attain the Orthodox mindset, the Orthodox phronema, right? Then the terms take on the meaning in Orthodoxy. Because if you don't understand that it's unique, Orthodoxy is unique, you're not even going to think of such a thing. It wouldn't even be possible. Well, we all mean the same thing. Aquinas means the same thing, and we're all saying the same words. No. It's a mindset that can only happen when you begin to undergo the actual transformation. That's why it can't be divorced from the liturgy, from the existential, from the personal, from the experiential. It can't just be rational and dry. And I would hear Orthodox people say that back when I was a Thomist, and I was like, yeah, okay, whatever, I believe that too. Yeah, we got to be pious. So what? Who doesn't believe that? No, it's not just about being pious. It's that you actually have to undergo a transformation before you see these things.
Yeah, it cannot be viewed from the outside, even if you're working on supposed piety and this different stuff. But that you have to acquire the phronimos of the church, that in a very relational way. And I always use this analogy that, I mean, think about if you just read my works and my philosophy, but you never entered into a kind of communion of relationship.
I would know about you, but I don't know you.
Yeah, and I guarantee you'd get all kinds of stuff wrong. You would misinterpret things. We know this because it's called Facebook and social media. We're constantly getting things wrong. Why? Because it's just these abstract kind of words and statements. Right. But when you enter into a relationship and you build a life with somebody, then you come into a shared being and communion in which you know them in a much more intimate way. And that's not intellectual, but it's now the heart. And in the heart is now showing the mind where to go. It's the love that's illuminating the mind.
That brings us to nous. Explain to us, Father. So I'm the Roman Catholic, and I'm like, I hear you Orthodox people tell. Eric Ibarra said this after our debate. So you guys are always talking about nous. what is this? I got to have a purified nous. Isn't that just intellect? What do you mean?
Yes, so we have, again, it seems that the West is plagued with a kind of dialectic problem. And I'm not saying that everybody's a substance dualist in the West. But even, for example, I wouldn't classify Aristotle as a substance dualist. I know Richard Swinburne kind of interprets Aristotle in somewhat that way. But what you do see is a kind of dualism of, what do you have? The immaterial soul is the life principle of the body. So and part of the immaterial soul is the nous, the mind, the highest faculty of the anima of the soul of the human person. But then the body. So you have this kind of dualistic notion throughout Western thought. But in the East, and there are some similarities with Plato and the tripartite soul, but we have more of a tripartite understanding of anthropology. And surprise, surprise, again, that the notion of the Trinity being expressed in perichoresis within Christ should make this evident too. So like we were talking about, all these things hinge on with one another. And so in the West, and particularly within scholasticism, it is the mind that's the highest faculty of man. That the imago Dei, the image of God, is the intellect.
The mind, yeah, exactly.
The mind. And so everything's filtered through the mind. And again, this is going to carry out into the Protestant Reformation too, that, well, then the mind and the person, the soul, person becomes the ultimate arbitrator of what's true or false and what's heretical and what's not, and what parts of the fathers they're going to pick up and like, and what other parts they're wrong on. But in the East, again, we start with the revelation of who God is three persons. And again, you have this, and Maximus talks about this too, you have this expressed image of community. Three persons co-eternally in love with one another. You have this community within the human person too. And so what we'd say in an analogous way, the tripartite notion and the human person, according to Eastern Orthodox, very different from the West, is that man has the physicality. He has that part of the soul. He has the mind, the intellect. But then we have the deepest, most innermost regions of man. The organ that, it's not the mind that connects to God. In fact, in Eastern Orthodoxy, it's the mind is the domain of demons. That's where we're getting all our demonic chatter and temptations from. But it is the heart that is innermost. And so what the fathers had to, again, take the Greek word nous that referred to strictly mind, and they gave it a new meaning, but they gave it something like the eyes of the heart.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you a question real quicker, because this is something that sometimes gets confused. And even I've had questions on this topic that I'm not 100% clear about. And I've tried to, I've read, Metropolitan, Herotheos, and people that are really good on this. By the way, his book on nature and person is really good. Person in the Orthodox tradition is really good, by the way. But so now I realize the problem with that, obviously, of exalting the intellect to become what it is to be the highest faculty in man. But I've heard some things that I'm not clear about. Maybe you clear it up. I've heard sometimes it sounds like some Orthodox theologians, like I think Metropolitan Herotheus, I'm going from memory. So I think he speaks like the mind is the realm of the demonic. But I've also heard things like, well, Christ having fully human mind, body, soul, will is part of the healing of man. So you can't have so it's a faculty that's proper to nature. You can't have a faculty that is demonic. I know you're not saying that the mind is demonic, but it's the realm, the doorway perhaps by which those kinds of temptations and discursive dianoia and the demonic temptations can come, the doorway. But isn't it true? I'm trying to remember how it was phrased. Somebody said something like so you've got maybe things out of order where you've got like intellect suppressing the heart, and you think that the intellect is what's most important, say in the West, right? They might have some theoretical idea that, oh yeah, okay, well, man has a heart or whatever. The rise of Jesus' sacred heart. That's the balancing out of this. No. Nous is not identical to some bodily heart. It's like the heart of hearts, the innermost being of man, where man communes with God. God gave us this faculty, one of the saints says, so that we could commune with him directly. It's been darkened after the fall by the passions, of course. But so the idea is that it's out of whack where you've got the intellect and the mind is like what's seen as priority, is having priority. That's an aspect of the fall. So what has to happen is that the heart has to be, the heart of hearts of man has to be put back into the proper function of being primary, and then it integrates intellect. Not that it makes intellect or discursive dianoia, that reasoning primary, it doesn't, but that intellect assumes its proper position as subordinate to heart. Is that correct?
That's right. That's exactly
okay.
So there's there's a disorder.
Yes.
That comes about through what sin is. That this is what Scripture says: lean not on your own understanding, because it was. You have this notion even in the definition of heresy, an individual opinion. It's a separating out. And if you think about the word diablos, meaning like divider.
Okay, yeah, like a dividing out of something that should be integrated. Should be integrated.
You're supposed to be in communion, but Adam and Eve, when they sin, they a principle of that sin, and again, these are all tied up, is not only a dividing, but an exaltation of the mind and the pride that, I think I know what's right. So what you already within that act, you have a movement towards disorder and dividing the natural parts that are in a symphony working correctly. And they're divided now. They're broken apart. And that's the notion of diablos and evil, to break apart and divide. And so now what was in unity, both in communion with God and nature in the garden and with fellow man, is now at odds.
And that's like dialectics, putting things against tension, adversary. Yes. Satan's the adversary, right? So a heretic, right? To divide, reject the heretical man because he's divisive. Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
So it's exactly what you said. Then, when people ask me this, if they come and they're having a particular struggle or temptation, what are they to do? Well, the fathers talk about, usually the medicine is the opposite of.
Oh yeah, right.
And so the cure for this is to humble oneself, as you said, to bring the mind not exalted above the heart, but to bring it down into the heart.
Yes.
A humble heart God will not despise, it says in Psalm 50. And that as we begin to do this, because again, this is the nature of God, is humility. And to bring our whole being and personhood back into that proper natural relationship, then the heart begins to heal the mind so that it can see correctly. So anytime that we exalt and I've even seen this too when I give transcendental arguments from a kind of presuppositionalism and talk about that nobody's in a position to know. This kind of pretended autonomy of man. Again, this all harkens back to the fall. That I can by myself explain myself and explain my reasoning, and they don't even realize they're caught up in circular reasoning. If your reason and your senses and your faculties are what in question, and I ask you, how can you apprehend reality correctly? You can't go around and be like, well, let me use my reason and faculties to tell you how that I can fix this. And so again, it's this exalting of the intellect. And so even when I give a transcendental argument and say, look, the starting point is not the mind. The starting point is God, who has revealed himself to us.
Yeah,
They go, yeah, but how do we know? What do? They keep dragging it back down into,
Yes.
well, put it in a logical
Excuses.
formula for me.
Yeah.
Put it, it's like, you don't realize that's the starting point that makes logic, reason, science, everything, and morality possible. So they just don't get it. They're stuck in, again, because their paradigm is this kind of dualistic
Yes.
mind
Even
and
Bahnsen-
body,
even
and mind is the
Bahnsen-
highest.
Even Bahnsen, who unfortunately was very trapped in a lot of the rationalism, even Bahnsen was very insightful and almost came really close to the Orthodox view by always pointing out, he says, you know what, man's problem isn't a lack of facts or logic and reasoning. Those become excuses for man. He says, man's problem, Bahnsen would always say, he would always say, heart of hearts. And I think, I mean, he didn't know what nous in the Orthodox conception was, but I think that's what he meant. And
He had an intuition.
He knew that basically that it's not a problem of facts and evidences. It's man's heart. It's his nous, his heart of hearts, Bahnsen would always say, is the source of the problem. And that's why, like you just said, when you begin to talk about this, what's the first thing that the atheist or a person who's in the process of rebellion does is that they begin to do the rationalization. Oh, let's take it back over here into the realm of, well, there's not actually any evidence. There's not actually any proof. Logic's on my side at the same time as he's anti-logic. Yeah, there's no,
Right.
all just chaos. It's all chaos. Oh, how's their logic? So yeah, that's a great point, is that it expresses rebellion at all these points, which actually I think which vindicates the fall.
So,
like, why would everybody
the
be
innermost being of man is the nous, is the way that
that brings me to the next one. Now I know we've covered this before, but you would be a great person to ask about this. Let's move to logos. Okay, I mean, John 1:1, 2, 3. In the beginning was the word, the logos. Why are they saying this? What does logos mean? Why is this a big deal? I mean, isn't this a Greek philosophic term?
Yep, that's right. And so again, contrasting that with, by the way, should we just thinking, well, contrasting that with the fathers, not contrast, but going back to what we're saying, the fathers that give it some of these Greek terms new meanings, and hearkening back to what we're saying, why is Christ foolishness to the Greeks? So you have to understand that the Greeks, so what logos means in Greek, it could be word, which in Latin is verbum. It could be account, rationality. It could be argument. It could be ultimate explanation. And so, again, these words are tied together in Greek philosophy. That
This is great. Yeah.
all of the Greeks were looking for an arche, a first principle that explained, well, in one sense, why is there order, number, and proportion rather than disorder?
Right.
And so their appeal was in various ways, and they all critique each other of that. No, that's not water can't be.
Yeah, right. It's all fire, bro. Obviously.
Yeah. And you get some get further than others, but ultimately, they're saying, they're appealing to the logos as an arche, that the logos is the principle. It's and typically the Greeks would see that, and you'll see this how this develops into this kind of notion of a generic monad God essence, because they thought it was ultimately one, because they see the many as disordered. And so they have this, again, a dialectical tension between the one
and many. Yeah. So everything must be just ultimately one, or getting back to the one, or at root one. Yeah.
Right. Anaxagoras says that everything was mixed together, but nous, and he's appealing to nous in the form of a logos, but nous is pure and not mixed. And nous enters in, and this is what kind of gives order to disorder.
And he's not using nous in the Orthodox way. He means like
No,
an
in the Greek
overriding
canon.
mind, right?
Yeah. So, but this is a transcendent, impersonal
Yes.
explanation. This is why when it gets later worked out in and other people like Parmenides, that it's being, the logos is being, or in Plato, that's the form of the good. This does nothing. It's not in, it can emanate, it can explain order, because really the logos is a principle of explanation. Why is something intelligible? Why is, rather than disordered and unintelligible? But it doesn't act, it doesn't do, it is not a person.
Right.
And this is why in Plato you have the demiurge.
Yes.
It's the demiurge that has to look upon the forms under the light, the form of the good, under that logos to then make and create. So the demiurges are personal, but not the logos. So the Greeks never had a notion of logos as personal.
Okay. Right.
This is something new with when we have the apostles come and say, look, this unknown God, we know him.
Yes.
It's not impersonal for us. He's a person.
I would add too, and I have an essay on this. I'll send it to you. I'd be interested in your opinion. You may disagree with my analysis, but one of the things I noticed was that John isn't. Obviously, he is drawing from the Hellenic philosophers to appeal to Greeks, just like Paul was, and they're trying to transform that term logos to say that we've got it as Jesus. But some people forget too that John is not just operating in the Hellenic scheme. He's also appealing to the wisdom tradition, and the wisdom tradition of the Hebrews has a similar idea with wisdom, because the logos is not just the word. Jesus is also identified as the wisdom of God, and there's a lot of parallels between the way the Greeks would understand the logos and nature and the way the Hebrews understood from Proverbs, Sirach, Ecclesiasticus, and so forth, wisdom. The wisdom tradition, the wisdom that is in nature for the Hebrew mind, right, is an energy, a manifestation, evidence of our God, the true personal God. And so Paul, just like John, right, they can utilize the Hebrew wisdom tradition and the Greek Hellenic tradition and say that this is pointing to the same Christ. But a lot of people forget that, or they don't know that.
I think I agree. That's a great point.
John is also pulling from the Hebrew wisdom text.
That's a great point. And so, again, these notions of verbum, veritas, arche, I'll mix the Greek and Latin too, because, but I don't know if you remember when the pagan Augustine is in the court orator, and he meets St. Ambrose for the very first time, and they have this kind of conversation about the logos. And pagan Augustine is still caught up in this impersonal, and they almost have kind of a Pontius Pilate Christ kind of conversation, quid is veritas, what is truth?
Yeah.
And Augustine begins to embrace this kind of philosophic, not personal notion of truth, and his fine eloquence and rhetoric before the court, because this is his first time to basically impress the court and the Imperium. And Ambrose turns to him and says, "No, Augustine, truth is a person, and it's Christ." And he silences him, like he can't speak. And that must have hit St. Augustine's heart, that, And that's exactly it. That how
Right.
radical a change.
A difference, right, from the Greeks. Yeah.
That to be like it's a person and it's Jesus Christ. And so this is very important to understand that it carries the same notions. It's not like there's a loss of meaning between the ultimate explanation, the
Yeah.
account,
Right.
the word, the logic, the explanation for it says all things that were made through him, and nothing that was not made was not made through him.
Right.
So it is the ultimate explanation of all things, but the addition that Revelation gives to us is that it's a person, it's the light of men, it's become one of us.
Exactly.
This really is going to solve the problem, and this is why I think the transcendental arguments and presuppositionalism and the church fathers is so important, is that unlike kind of evidentialist apologetics, natural theology,
Yeah.
or natural philosophy, natural theology, where this kind of classical foundationalism gets you to generic God.
Right.
What you start to see, the way that the fathers talk about, is that if none of us are in a position to know, that we reduce ourselves to things and trying to explain our things, and we're in this kind of vicious circle, and an epistemic quagmire of circularity, that obviously you could see that, well, there has to be somebody that's not in the same predicament, that's not contingent, that's not a created being, that would know all things. But if that's just an abstract logos, transcendent, that's not going to solve our problem.
Right.
How we can know. And so the transcendental argument, you get very specific.
Yep.
This God that has these properties that would be the only necessary condition that would satisfy the possibility of knowledge, has to become immanent within the world too. And not only that, has to become one of us to heal the problem.
Yes, St. Maximus says
John
that too.
says he's the light of men.
Yeah.
And so, anyways.
Well, and also on that point, that's a great bridge into discussing logos, is to discuss the logi. And this is one of the more fascinating areas of St. Maximus, who really expanded on this in depth in the Ambiguum and in some other places as well. But I would add that, first of all, I think the logi is taught by Paul. I think Paul teaches in the Colossians when he talks about all of reality is summed up in Christ. In the Colossians, he says that very clearly. Okay, so I think it's implied in John 1 with the Logos doctrine of St. John. I think Irenaeus touches on the logi. We can go up into Basil, speaks of the logi. St. John Damascus speaks of it. And as we said, St. Maximus really fleshes it out. Other Cappadocians, Gregory Nyssa mentions it actually in the debate with Eunomius in certain places. So this is important because we have to understand that this is another one of the reasons that we don't believe in natural theology in the Thomistic sense, because we're saying that the fundamental fabric of reality, yes, what we see and what's here is created, but there's also, as St. Maximus says in Ambiguum 7, there's the uncreated logi, which are the patterns. The terms used are patterns, archetypes, principles, predeterminations, and exemplars. I would agree with Torstein Tolleson that it is fine to use that term as long as we don't get trapped into the Western Platonic mode of thinking that they are identical to the essence of God. But it roughly captures the same idea of what we're talking about. And Maximus seems to say, St. Maximus seems to say that, and the Origen also did deal a lot with this, but we have to be careful because Origen is not Orthodox, obviously. But he was still influential on the Cappadocians. So there are some elements where the Logi doctrine in Origen, but again, it's prior to Origen.
He's going to have a problem because of the one's movement towards the dyad. It's a fall, and this is going to bring about heretical ideas.
It does, and he also,
one
when he
minute.
talks about the recapitulation, the restoration, he takes it. He seems to think that if there is a restoration of the logia of all created things, in Origen's mind, it seems to suggest that everything is restored, even all the demons, and that to have free will, well, then that necessitates the possibility of future falls. But he has a dialectical doctrine of what free will is between good and evil, which is false. But anyway, and he goes back to divine simplicity. But so the logi are very important, though, because if the fundamental fabric of reality is not, number one, created things, it's not created essences, it's uncreated logi. Oh, and by the way, I should also, they're thought wills, right? So the terms are thought will, predeterminations, patterns, archetypes, principles, exemplars.
Principles of intelligible being is another.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so my understanding is that they are the eternal predeterminations. They're not synonymous with the essence of God, and they're not synonymous with the attributes of God from all eternity, as St. Gregory Palamas is very clear, because he goes into the logi too. They're related, they're God related to creation, and they were not necessary. So God didn't have to bring any of these into being. He can freely bring the logi into being or choose not to. And this is why there's actually a comment in St. Maximus and St. Gregory, quoting St. Maximus, that God's logi, his works are infinite. There's actually an infinite number of uncreated energies. And he says, we'll never even know all the works of God. That's why another reason you can't identify in Maximus the energies of God with the essence of God, because that would be total nonsense. There's no way, he couldn't say that. He couldn't make that statement. So, but the created world is patterned on the divine mind. There's nothing wrong with saying that, and that's true. This gets into a problem, though, that plagued me for many years, and I have to say that there's an essay by Father Florovsky, Creation and Creaturehood, not the Athanasius and Creation one. That one's really good too, but this one's called Creation and Creaturehood, and it's just on the logi, and he shows how there's an uncreated and a created aspect to the logi. And this is what's very key, because a lot of times if you don't get that, you'll get confused and you'll think that they're like the essence of God or something. Like they're not. So there's the uncreated logi, the thought wills. God didn't have to bring them to be, but if he does bring them to be, then there is a created aspect that reality reflects. So I have to disagree at this point with Romanides on this point, because Romanides says there's absolutely no similarity between anything uncreated and what's created. I think that's completely night and day with Ambiguum 7 of St. Maximus. They couldn't be patterns and archetypes, if that was true. But it doesn't mean that we're identifying the uncreated logi with the essence of God. That's the key point of departure from the Roman Catholics here, because his concern definitely is to avoid the Roman Catholic analogia applying to the divine essence. So we don't.
You're going to essence and energies distinction. There is some parallel between the kind of Platonic idea of form of the good as being God, and if you just understood that is, the Holy Trinity is personal, but then the forms. So the logoi are there's a parallel with the forms as being principles of intelligible being, which are eternal.
Yeah,
they're distinct from God, God's essence, and there's nothing in the forms that necessitate creation. So you have to understand that God is
free will.
Unlike that. He's utterly free. He's not even bound by his own nature. And therefore, his act of will is actually what brings things into being. And this is, you're only going to get this in Orthodox theology, that because within the Western scholastic paradigm, the Latin paradigm, if God is his being, you have to contrast that with in Orthodoxy. Well, first of all, he would be bound by his own nature, but furthermore, we say that God creates being, so he must be beyond being. And
also the if you identify the exemplars with the essence of God, which Roman Catholicism absolutely does, Aquinas is very explicit. it makes creation necessary, right? If all those created beings have their original exemplars in the essence of God, they have to come to be. They're just as necessary as the essence of God is. So if there's an eternal pattern or archetype of you in the essence of God, you had to come to be, and your existence is just as necessary and eternal as a kind of reflection. So this eternal reflection view ultimately compromises the doctrine of ex nihilo creation and God freely creating, and we're back into Platonism and emanationism. So that's why it's very key, as we have to say the logi are not the essence of God, but they do fulfill a similar function to some of the problems in philosophy that Plato raised, and that is definitely the way that many of the Eastern Fathers, when they bring this in, that's how they utilize it. So can we say there's seeds of the Logos all through the world? Yes, but it doesn't mean that we can't expand that into like some kind of universalism or something like that. That's not necessarily what it means. And Maximus is the most clear on this, because he says, yes, it's true that in the fall, there is a rupture between the logi and the created forms. And what happens in the recapitulation in Christ is that when Christ takes on human nature and then redeems the world, there is a cosmic scope to this. And so there is a restoring of what's jolted out of place, even in the natural cosmic world. So things will be restored to their proper unity in terms of the logi, you could say, the created and the uncreated. But that doesn't mean that everybody's saved, because the experience that you'll have of the afterlife is the way that you, the mode in which you utilized your will determine your experience. We're all going to the same afterlife, but the experience of that afterlife in the Orthodox view, as I understand, is going to be conditioned upon how we use our will in this life. Did we move towards virtue or towards vice? So that's how Maximus does have a view of recapitulation, where all things are restored, but it's not universal salvation, because beings that have the usage of will enact that will, and they will specifically have a unique, I'm not saying that everybody gets their own hell, you know what I'm saying? But you're either going to have a positive or a negative experience based on how you use your will in this life to progress in virtue, which he means theosis, right? So that's why he says grace is most natural to man. He doesn't have this two-tiered, like a grace versus nature view. Grace, he says, is the most natural thing to man.
Yeah.
Does that make
Maybe
sense?
that's a good transition into Maximus' conversation about will and the two different distinctions that we make.
Like gnomic will and like natural will, gnomic will. My understanding, so this is Athanasius 21, I think 21 or 22, and he goes into detail about why there's gnomic will. Originally, he didn't think that that Christ possessed a gnomic will, but this deals. I was actually wrong about this 4 years ago. I was wrong. I thought that the Orthodox position, and I think it was an error. I overall, Mindor is pretty good. He's got a few areas where, but he was actually, I think, wrong on this point, and I had picked it up from Mindor without knowing that. I thought, well. And actually, I don't feel too bad, because apparently St. Maximus changed his view over this on time. But originally, he thought Christ possessed a gnomic will, and he just thought, well, it had to be that way. But he changed his mind, because what this means is the gnomic will is the mode that human will possesses after the fall. And after the fall, it possesses blameless passions and blameful passions. Blameful passions would be passions that we consent to that becomes sinful passions, right? So there are blameless passions, Maximus concludes, as a result of the fall, such as hungering, thirsting, a kind of natural desire to preserve one's life even. So the focus of this debate with certain heretics, particularly monothelites, becomes, Father, let this cup pass from me. So eventually Maximus is led to explain that it's not wrong of Christ to pray that the Father take that cup from him, or to take let him not die if it's possible, but he will submit to the Father's will, because there's a natural desire to preserve one's life that actually God gave us. That's not bad, but that Christ did not possess, even though he was tempted in every way like us, he did not possess the quote sinful disordered passions, because he did not possess a fallen human nature. He assumed, Maximus says, the blameless passions, and never was there any possibility of him having full passions or consenting to sin. He was tempted in every way, but did not sin, Paul says, right? And that's because, well, for one, he's a divine person. There's no created human hypostasis present in him that's like doubting and fearing and wondering, will I be saved? What should I do? I don't know what's coming, right? That's why none of the Orthodox fathers ever exegete the passages about him. Oh, Jesus doesn't know the day of his coming. That's not how we understand those texts. That's how the Arians understand those texts. That's how Nestorians would exegete those texts to say, oh, there's a created human person who's learning new facts and progressing, and he's doubting and he doesn't know. And no, Christ never possessed any deliberative doubt. At no point did he ever was his will in fluctuation. We fluctuate in our wills. We deliberate. We doubt. We possess an anomic will because we are sons of Adam. This is why Christ is born of a virgin.
Finds this in disputations with Purus,
Yes.
where he defines anomic will is the self-chosen impulse and movement of reasoning towards maybe one thing or another. So if you start to unpack that definition, you'll realize that it's not a natural faculty.
Right.
That
it's the mode of will in terms of fallen persons.
Yeah, so it presupposes a natural will.
A natural will, that's right. Correct. Exactly.
And again, so
and I meant to say he willfully assumed that, right? That's another important point,
yes.
because it wasn't forced on him. He didn't have his life forcefully taken from him. He willingly, even says to what he said to Pilate, you would have no power over me unless it was given. I willingly lay my life down. You can't take it from me. I'm doing it willfully. So the passions the blameless passions that he assumed, Maximus says he did willingly. It's not because it was forced upon him. No violence was done to him, because his divine nature is impassible. It can't be changed. But he deifies our humanity, and that's why this is all salvific. It's all for us. It's for us. Many fathers use the term by appropriation. So if he uses terms like, you should pray like this, it's not because he needed to pray. He's doing it for our sakes.
Yeah. And so, it's helpful to unpack the etymology too. So when he says nomic will, nomikon thalema, that this comes from nome, which does mean purpose or consent or decision. But this arises from your desirous orientation. And that depends on when you deliberate and try to make a judgment. And this all goes back to Aristotle too, that your judgments and actions are based on your dispositional state. The Greek word's hexis. And this gets into really cool stuff with like virtue and virtue ethics, stuff like that. But why this is important is, people in the issue of free will, people often wonder, well, when we get to paradise after the final judgment, can we choose evil? Oh no, we can't choose it. So you can't fall because you're in paradise and you're impeccable. So therefore you must not have free will. Well, this is exactly why
Origen's dilemma, yeah.
Yeah, that we need the distinction that Maximus draws out between nomic will and that
natural will, yeah.
Nomic will would be the choice between seeing two of good and evil.
Yeah, right.
And therefore you think that my free will is only simply to choose between either what's
and it's defined dialectically. That's how Origen thinks that it has to always be the dialectical decision between good or evil. That's not what free will is. Free will is a choice between multiple goods in its purest sense, because in Eden, Adam and Eve had free will. God has free will, right? Well, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because the ends for which you're choosing are not conditioned by the fallen state, right? So just like in Eden, in the same way in the eschaton, you have the possibility of choosing multiple goods. And that's another reason why the beatific vision and absolute divine simplicity is not true.
Good point. So St. Maximus, by defining natural will as a faculty that's desirous of what's in accordance with nature.
Yes.
And again, this is why we don't use silly concepts and phrases like sin nature. This doesn't make any sense. But when your faculty is defined as a natural faculty in accordance with your nature, it holds together all those attributes that essentially belong to your nature, then you will always, free will is now free, not because you have the ability to choose between good or evil. You don't choose evil. It is between choices of infinite goods, between divine energies. And this is what paradise is going to be. It's not going to be, I just get to choose one good, and that's contemplating and doing philosophy for eternity about the one divine and simple essence.
About the absolutely simple essence. Stare into the essence of the TV screen all eternity. That's it.
Yeah.
And that view, by the way, totally neglects the body. I mean, that was a big one that hit me when I was Roman Catholic, big hardcore Thomas. I know that Thomas believes in the bodily resurrection, but the problem is that the beatific vision is so intellectually focused. The whole idea is, the intellect is finally satiated by seeing the, goodness and beauty of the divine essence, which has always been searching for. It's now satiated, like this sort of weird, like happiness. Like you finally meet your happy state when you stare into the satiating essence. I thought we were resurrected in a body, right? I mean, we are, right? And this totally neglects the resurrection of the body, because the resurrection of the body, I know we don't really understand the mechanics of what it's going to be like in the, new heavens, new earth, eternal state, and all that eschaton. But we know that Christ is resurrected in that same body. So there's some correspondence that's still going on here, because it's at least the body that has the pierced side, right? I mean, it's the same guy, the same body, you could say. So in the same way, we know that in our resurrection, John says, our lowly body will be conformed to his. John says we shall be like him, we shall see him as he is. So our body's going to be like that. We're going to be resurrected the same person. So it's true that Maximus talks about seeing all things in God, but he doesn't mean the Thomistic beatific vision, because he actually says that what we see is the uncreated logi. Mm-hmm. That's what it is, to see all things in God. So he sees it, as you said, as not an absolutely simple essence that you're peering into for all eternity. Into, if you were to ever verge your gaze away from that, you'd be in the originist thing of, I'm falling again. I'm falling into multiplicity because my will chose that. No, it's not. The problem is not choice. Free will is choice. The fathers always say this. So how do you retain free will in the eschaton if there's no choice? There's only the absolutely simple one thing to will, the essence. Well, that's because there's not just the essence of God to will. You don't ever know the essence of God. You know God, and you know the saints, and you know whatever metaphysical status the eschaton is. There's going to be, new heavens and new earth, a new world, right? And that you will have that same body. That's my understanding. And so I just think that the Roman Catholic beatific vision does such a Gnostic disservice to the goodness of the body in the resurrection. Mm-hmm. And the possibility of willing.
Yeah. Why would you need a physical body? It doesn't.
Yeah. We ought to be shedding it to stare into the essence, or to be one with the essence, or whatever it is we do in that system. So let's see. Now, I've gotten to a lot of the big terms. Did you have any more on that? I don't want to cut you off.
No, that's it. That's great on that one.
Let's see. So we did gnomic will, natural will. It's important to stress too, as you mentioned, a great book that really harmonized a lot of this for me was The Disputation with Pyrrhus of St. Maximus, because he'll go into gnomic will. He'll go against the dialectics of grace versus free will, of Calvinist type things. He'll talk about Christ possessing free will, and once you understand that, he'll talk about energies. Maybe briefly, let's get into the big hot button term, essence energeia. Right? Why is this such a big deal?
So let's define what energeia in the Greek is: activities, actions. And I guess why that's important is that this becomes the means by which we know who a person is. So I know you by your activities. So again, when we do this kind of analogy, there's obviously going to be things that are analogous and then things that aren't when it pertains to God. So the way that I know who you are as a person is through your activities, but you are not your activities. When it comes to God, the way that we know God's activities, who God is through his activities. Unlike us, in which our activities are energeas, our actions are created and temporal, and they're distinct from who we are, we'll say with God, they are God. And I'm trying to remember who phrased it. They are God, not in himself, but outside of himself.
Yeah, I think Palama, I think St. Gregory Palama says that.
Yeah, and what's really nice is that, you really get, and David Bradshaw has a great work.
Yes, I was going to say,
on this, and an article too. So not only in Aristotle East and West does he talk about this, but he has an article on the divine energies. Hold on one second.
While you're getting that, it reminds me too of the fact that in that recent interview that he did, he made a great point. Reminded me that the language of Latin seems to limit. He says that, and I'm not a Latin scholar, but he knows the linguistics. He says that the Latin perspective on the being and the action is limiting. So in their mind, they couldn't really conceive of things outside of just cause and effect, or they couldn't understand a layer of nuance that the Greek mind had, to where the being and the action of the being could be at least theoretically distinguished, right? So that's why actus purus was so easy for the Latin mind, and it's so hard for them to conceive of the fact that we're making not just a distinction between the person or the being and the being's action, but we're making a distinction between hypostasis, between nature, between act, and the effect of the act. This is St. John Damascus even goes a layer further, and he says that we in book 3, when he on Christology, when he's citing and explaining the differences, he says we make the distinction between the subsistence or the person that's acting, the nature of that person that's acting, the action, and the effect of the action. He says they're all distinct. Now, they're unified in the sense that they're all related. It's one being acting, one person, whatever, whether it's God or whether it's, well, in the case of God, it's Father, Son, and Spirit acting. But whether it's one God acting or whether it's a person acting, we make those distinctions because it's obvious. For one, you're not the same thing as the action of building the house, right? You're not the same thing as the energy that you put in to build that house. You're not the same thing as the house. And you're not the same thing as human nature, right? These are all distinctions that are made, but because they're distinctions, it doesn't mean that it's all chopped up and divided in that there's not a unity. Now, in the case of humans, yes, there's composition because we're created composite beings. In the case of God, there's distinctions, but no composition. God's not made up of parts, right? Okay. How is that possible? All the Thomists say. Well, the answer is that he transcends those categories. It's possible because he's God. And we're not just putting the mystery where Thomists say, oh, you're just sticking the mystery there and saying, well, it's possible because God transcends. No. It's because that's how it's revealed to us. That's how Scripture reveals it to us. That's how the fathers have explained it and revealed it to us, right? There was a debate with a Thomist who made this point. He was saying, he says, I can prove you wrong because you admit that we can use logic to some degree to speak about God. And if logic does tell us about God, then God has to be equal to logic. God is logic. And if God is logic, then God is just as rational and reasonable as saying the law of identity. There's no point at which God would ever go outside of laws of logic. And I said, I can disprove that to you easily, Mr. Thomas. I mean, this guy was being really extreme, but and I know that most Thomas would say that, but I was like, do you believe that God is 1 and 3? Right. So if you're going to predicate with identity of God, that God is 1, this is what we brought up earlier, then you can't also say that he's 3, right? Both of those things can't both be true at the same time. So they can be true, as you pointed out in this discussion many times. God is 1 and many because he transcends, as Palamas says, the logical categories. Saying God transcends the logical categories doesn't mean that we just believe chaos and total incoherence. There's a difference between a transcending a thing and being irrational. I personally wouldn't say is God irrational. I was like, well, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Do you mean that he transcends human reasoning and infinitude? Absolutely. But is he irrational in the sense that he contradicts himself? No. Scripture says God can't contradict himself.
Yeah, great point. And the reason why the Gregory Palamas and the Cappadocian Fathers, and they work this out, is because, again, what's been revealed to us, it was the quote I was thinking was from St. John Damascus on the Orthodox, an exact exposition of Orthodox faith, that he exists, but what he is beyond all comprehension. And I've got a wonderful quote here by Gregory Palamas. He says, the superessential nature of God is not a subject for speech or thought or even contemplation, for it is far removed from all that exists and more unknowable and more than unknowable. So it's not, I love that he puts the superlative there. It's not just unknowable, it's more than unknowable. There is no name hereby to be named. So not even apophatic names are hitting the essence of
right. Yeah, and he argues back to that. Yeah, he quotes St. Dionysius on that. And there's a great section in the debate with the Barlaamite where the Barlaamite says, you just said that God's energies are really distinct, but you also said that God is fully present in every one of his energies. He says, how is that not a contradiction? St. Gregory Palamas says, I will cite Dionysius to you and say that it's not a contradiction because God has revealed that and he transcends the philosophic categories.
Now, the way that the Thomas is going to try to answer this, because obviously you have quotes like this all over the Fathers, and they're going to agree that God's essence is comprehension, and this is why Aquinas uses the via negativa, and then he says, but there's two other ways we can talk. The via similitude, the way of similitude, and the analogia entis. Now, they think that solves the problem for them.
Right.
The problem is that, again, analogy of being requires a likeness between what is non-contingent, uncreated being there is no likeness to created contingent being. So that's not going to work.
Right.
So what Gregory Palamas and Cappadocian Fathers are able to do is what in the West would be seems to be an irreconcilable difference.
Exactly.
It's the energies that solve this exact problem.
Right.
So what we do believe in an analogia entis, but it applies to the energies that are multiple, they're uncreated, and they really are God. They're just God outside of his essence. And so through these distinctions, we're able to avoid the aporia in Greek, the problem. And so again, it just comes back to the whole reason why we're giving this talk. Why are these words important?
Yes. And you'll see, as you said earlier, consistently, how can Christ's two natures interpenetrate one another without there being dialectical confusion, division? And the answer of the Fathers is because God is God. God has revealed it that way, and that he can do that. How could God be fully present in the energies and they be really distinct? Because God transcends the Hellenic categories. How can God be one and many? Because God transcends the Hellenic categories. I mean, the same argument keeps popping up from the time of the 3rd century all the way up to the Barlaamite arguing with St. Gregory Palamas, and they answer the same way. So the mere fact that the answer is always the same from the time of the 3rd, 4th, 5th, so arguing with Arians over how can the Son be caused, but also of the same, divinity of the Father, because God has revealed it to be so, and he transcends the created logical categories over and over and over and over, right? The dispute with Pyrrhus, how is this possible? It's either or, over and over and over, because God transcends the Hellenic categories. And we're not just saying, it's not just a placeholder, a God of the gaps, like, oh, well, every time there's a problem, you just say God transcends it. No, no, no. It's because that's how it's revealed to be. It's not just speculating. It's St. Gregory's not just sitting back speculating. So, well, I'll just reconcile it by saying that, man, like God transcends it all.
It's like what Heidegger does. Let's just create this word, projected, throw it, handedness.
Yeah.
That's what philosophers do when they can't solve something. They just make up a word.
Make up a word, right? Make up a new neologism. Yeah.
Yeah, that obviously revealed truth, true theology is not even in that same category whatsoever.
And the mere fact that we're saying we believe in a Trinity should show this. I mean, come on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in other words, if they wanted to be more consistent with that sort of strict rationalist approach, they need to go in the direction of modalism. The Eunomians were more consistent on this because they actually said, yes, we can define and know the essence of the Father, and the essence of the Father is to be ungenerate. And since that's the is of definition of who he is, anything else is a lesser distinct composite thing or a creature or a lot. So hence the Son being distinct, he's a creature. And they were more radical than Arius, right? So they took their simplicity to its logical conclusion, making, I mean, if they wanted to have an analogia entis that actually matched up, but I mean, in other words, it's almost like Eunomius is saying, I'm going to bite the bullet and say, I do know the essence of God, and it's to be the Father. You see what I'm saying? He's more consistent than Aquinas, is what I'm trying to say.
No, absolutely. And I appreciate that consistency, because it's good to point out that when you embrace these certain principles, it's a type of reductio where it leads to.
Well, it leads to that leads you to the perennialism, to the generic theism, to all the religions are just one. There's one general God, and if that's true, then we're not Christians anymore, and we're back to what, some version of monotheism, like Islam, some version of Judaism, or something else. I mean, Christianity is not that, obviously. So that's why we can't mix the Hellenic generic theism or the generic monotheism with the specific revelation of Christ from the Father and in the Spirit.
Yeah. And also, I just add one last thing, that by uncreated energies is what makes possible theosis for us.
Right.
Because
not grace. Yeah.
When we're said to become one with God, obviously that can't be his essence.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore it's a life. It's a life with God. And his life are his activities, his uncreated energies. And we can participate those in various degrees. And so that's another thing. So again, just hammer it down again, that these terms are all connected, and that what you get within Eastern Orthodoxy is a coherent theology. Test for don't embrace philosophies or religions that are incoherent, that are nonsensical, that it's a test for consistency. And this is why the fathers have all these terms, is because it presents a coherent notion, because and obviously it's not man-made, it's not philosophy, it's not like, well, we'll just create this kind of scholastic project of
right.
We'll just all work it out. Again, it's what's been revealed.
Right. And it's also, yeah, I mean, it was providential that the New Testament goes into Koine Greek, that the apostles utilize the Septuagint, that they're using these terms. It's providential because God prepared that. Obviously, that's the only way that the gospel could extend out of the Hebraic context and into the Hellenic context to convert the Roman Empire. That's what happened. Obviously, it's very clear in God's providence that's what he was doing but so we don't then we worship Greek terms. No. It's not a superstition about the terms. It's that in God's providence, the Greek language had the nuance and the specification to allow for the seedbed of the church to utilize with freedom, not getting boxed into some system like you pointed out, but to have the freedom to utilize this or to utilize that, to throw that out, to use this, to put together this sort of mosaic that over the centuries in the councils is a very precise dogmatic process. Not the theology isn't evolving, but the clarifications are becoming more and more precise about what we don't believe. Here's the boundaries. Here are the boundaries of where we stop and say we don't do that.
And as you rightly pointed out, that restricting yourself solely to the Latin language and being ignorant of the Greek words in terms is precisely that led to all the problems with Rome. Whether that be the filioque, absolute divine simplicity, Augustine's inability to a lot of this, were, as much as I love Augustus, he was not familiar and capable of reading the Greek fathers.
Yes, as he says it on the Trinity. Correct, yeah. You there?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he has that weakness. I can't read the Greek fathers. He says, I hear there are many great lights in the East. He says, I submit this book to the judgment of the universal church. Oh, by the way, he didn't say, I just asked what Rome. So no, he says, I submit the book to the judgment of the universal church. So, and Bradshaw made that point pretty well, that there's limitations in the Latin language that didn't allow for the nuances. That's what we want to stress here again, is that people listening to this, watching this, hopefully it's been enlightening. There's a few more terms, but we could keep going all night. We can do a part 2. We can list out more terms. I'm sure people are going to have more questions. A few I want to get to that we'll save for the next time, like maybe go into Theotokos, the energetic manifestation. We can go into economia, pleroma, entelechy, aeon, which gnosis, and how it's used in a positive way. Maximus, even. Yes, the word Gnostic doesn't have to mean a crazy Crowleyan secret society. It can actually mean something positive. So apokatastasis, we want to look at all those as well, how they're used in different fathers. But hopefully this has been enlightening, and thank you so much to our favorite learned Father Deacon Dr. Ananias for his insights, his many nuggets of wisdom, because a lot of this I learn new stuff every day in this field. So thank you so much, and avoid the word concept fallacy. Don't get mad, don't get rash, take it easy, breathe, not you, but the audience. Right? And consider the possibility that maybe there are nuances that allow for distinctions that other systems can't have or don't allow. And that was my experience. Orthodoxy is a rich well of these kinds of nuances, and it's not just an intellectual thing. It actually is ultimately a thing that is like transformative.
Thank you, Jay, this was a wonderful talk, and I hope everybody learned something, and that we'll all continue to learn, and may God keep you, and through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon us and save us.
Amen.
Where do you think that philosophy would slot in to theology, now that we've acknowledged that they both kind of go hand in hand? Where would philosophy start to come in when you're debating someone or talking with someone?
Right. Yeah, I think this is a crucial question. And firstly, that quote, handmaiden of theology, actually goes back to my knowledge, it goes back to Philo, the early Jewish writer, post-Christ. And he does this analysis of like some crazy biblical typology, like modern, even Christians would look at that and be like, what? I don't see this. But he, if I'm remembering correctly, he analyzed the story of Abraham and Sarah and her handmaiden, and was like making the connection between how her handmaiden was a symbol of pagan philosophy, and then Sarah stood for theology, and I don't want to butcher it, but that type of typology is what you saw back in the ancient world that began with Philo. And Clement of Rome, a early Christian writer and philosopher, he took that analogy and ran with it. And he agreed with the typology. It was almost like unquestioned for them. That's sort of what we would call crazy biblical analysis and stuff. But they just took it for granted. So actually, Clement of Rome is the one who really popularized that idea of the handmaiden of theology. And really, the way I see it is that, and I think you can see this in sort of modern philosophy as well, is with philosophy, when you try to account for all of reality using philosophy or using rationality, you always run into certain limitations. So one example would be Immanuel Kant and his antinomies, which are basically paradoxes and contradictions. And he has this really famous book called The Critique of Pure Reason. And he's critiquing reason because he's trying to show that rationality or reason, it can't actually answer the fundamental questions. So Immanuel Kant basically said, oh, well, we just have to sort of have faith in God